She was sitting at the piano, and she couldn't look at him. He was sitting across the room, and he couldn't look at her either. The song they were about to record would become one of the greatest albums in the history of popular music. But in that studio, in that moment, something was breaking. Something that no amount of success, no amount of applause, no amount of money could fix. And the millions of people who would one day buy that album would have no idea what it had cost. That album was called The Visitors, and the people in that studio were ABBA. To understand what happened in 1981, you have to go back a few years. Not to the music, not to the tours or the television appearances, or the gold records stacked against the walls of Polar Music's Stockholm offices. You have to go back to the moment when the four people at the center of all of it began to realize that the life they had built together was quietly falling apart. It had started so differently. In the early 1970s, Björn and Agnetha Feldskog were married. Benny Andersson and Anni-Frid were together. Two couples, two voices, two songwriters, one extraordinary shared dream. The music they made together was unlike anything else on the radio. Melodic, emotional, impossible to ignore. And when Eurovision came in 1974, and Waterloo turned four Swedish musicians into a global phenomenon overnight, it felt like the beginning of something that could last forever. But fame has a way of testing things, of finding the cracks in a foundation and pressing on them, slowly, quietly, until something gives. Björn and Agnetha were the first to feel it. The touring was relentless. The recording schedule left no room for anything else. They had two young children at home, and a career that demanded everything. Agnetha has spoken about this in interviews, carefully, choosing her words the way someone chooses words when the truth is too heavy to carry all at once. She loved the music. She did not love what the music required of her life. By 1979, Björn and Agnetha's marriage was over. They announced it quietly. No drama, no public spectacle. Just two people who had tried and found that the trying was not enough. And here is where the story becomes something extraordinary. Something that no one who has not lived it could fully understand. Because the divorce did not end ABBA. It continued. The four of them walked back into the studio, and they kept making music, together. As if the most personal thing that had ever happened to two of them was simply something to be set aside when the microphone was live. But you cannot set those things aside. Not really. And the music, if you listen carefully, knew that. The albums that followed the divorce, Super Trooper, The Visitors, carried something that the earlier records did not. A weight, a darkness underneath the melodies. Songs about endings, about people who stay together long after the reasons for staying have gone. About the loneliness that lives inside success. Björn was writing about things he knew. Agnetha was singing them. And every word, every note, was real in a way that pop music rarely allows itself to be. But here is what nobody talked about at the time, and what makes this story something more than just a music industry cautionary tale. While Björn and Agnetha were navigating the wreckage of their marriage inside the walls of that studio, Benny and Anni-Frid were facing something of their own. Something quieter, something that had been building for years beneath the surface of their smiles and their stage costumes and their carefully maintained public image. And what happened next would change everything. There is a photograph taken during the recording of The Visitors. Four people standing together in a Stockholm studio. Smiling, professional, composed. If you did not know what was happening behind that smile, you would see exactly what ABBA wanted you to see. A group at the height of its powers, a team, a unit. Four people who had built something remarkable together and were still building it. But photographs lie, or rather, they tell only the part of the truth that the people in them are willing to show. Benny Andersson and Anni-Frid had finally married in 1978. It had taken years. Anni-Frid had waited, had believed, had built her life around a man who was also building an empire, and who sometimes struggled to separate the two. The wedding had felt like an arrival, like something that had been promised and had finally been delivered. And for a while, it was. But the same pressures that had broken Björn and Agnetha were pressing on Benny and Anni-Frid too. The studio, the tours, the relentless machine of ABBA's success that demanded more, always more, and gave back everything except time. Time for each other, time to be something other than musicians, time to be a husband and a wife, and not just two more voices in a Swedish pop group that happened to have conquered the world. And then, in the middle of all of it, something happened that had nothing to do with music. Anni-Frid's mother had died before she could know her. Her father, a German soldier, had left before she was born. She had grown up carrying a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of someone who does not know where they come from, of someone who has built everything they have on a foundation that has a hole in the middle of it. She had found family in ABBA, in Benny, in the music, in the extraordinary shared life they had created together. But you cannot fill that kind of hole with success. You cannot fill it with applause or gold records or sold-out arenas. And as the 1980s approached, as the world that ABBA had built began to show its cracks, Anni-Frid began to feel the weight of everything she had never been able to put down. Here is what makes this part of the story so difficult to tell. Because the public version of ABBA in 1980 and 1981 was still extraordinary. Super Trooper went to #1. The singles kept coming. The interviews were professional and warm and carefully managed. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. Benny was writing songs about people who were losing each other. Björn was writing lyrics about the end of things. Agnetha was singing words that she had lived. And Anni-Frid was standing in front of a microphone, giving everything she had to music that was, in ways she may not have fully understood at the time, a farewell. The Winner Takes It All was recorded in one session. Agnetha sang it in one take. Those who were in the studio that day have described what it was like to watch her. The song is written from the perspective of someone who has lost, who has loved and fought and been left behind. Björn wrote it, but Agnetha lived it, and everyone in that room knew it. This is the moment, if you're looking for one, when ABBA's story stops being a success story and becomes something else entirely. Something more complicated, something more human. 4 people who had given everything to something extraordinary, and were quietly paying a price that the world would never see. But the price was not finished yet, because what happened in 1981, what happened in those final months before ABBA walked into the studio for the last time, was something that none of them had fully prepared for. And it started with a phone call that Anni-Frid did not expect. The phone call came in the middle of a recording session. Anni-Frid stepped out of the studio. And when she came back, something in her face had changed. Those who were there that day have never spoken about it publicly. But the music that followed, the songs that were laid down in those final months of 1981, carried something new. Something that had not been there before. A finality, a sense of doors closing. The call was from Benny, and what he told her was that their marriage was over. There are moments in a person's life that divide everything into before and after. Anni-Frid had known more of those moments than most people. She had been born into absence, had grown up in the shadow of a father she never knew, had built everything she had from nothing, with her voice, with her talent, with a determination that people who knew her have described as something close to extraordinary. And now, in the middle of the most successful period of her professional life, the personal world she had built was collapsing around her. She did not stop. That is the part of this story that is almost impossible to understand from the outside. She walked back into that studio, and she sang. Day after day, session after session, standing next to the man who had just told her that their life together was ending, and finding somewhere inside herself the voice that millions of people around the world had fallen in love with. If you have ever listened to The Visitors, really listened, you can hear it. Not in one song specifically, but in the texture of the whole album. In the way Anni-Frid's voice carries something underneath the notes, a kind of controlled grief. The sound of someone who has decided that the show must go on, and is paying everything they have to make sure it does. Agnetha understood. She did not need Anni-Frid to explain. She had stood in that same place, had sung those same impossible songs next to the man she had loved and lost, had found a way to separate the professional from the personal in a way that most human beings are simply not built to do. They did not talk about it in interviews. They did not talk about it on stage. They carried it in the music, and they let the music carry it for them. But something was shifting beneath the surface of ABBA in those final months. Something that went beyond the personal pain of two broken marriages. The music itself was changing. The Visitors was unlike anything ABBA had made before. Darker, more experimental. The synthesizers that had once been decoration were now doing something structural, something that changed the emotional architecture of the songs entirely. Björn's lyrics had moved away from the melodic optimism of Waterloo and Dancing Queen and Fernando. He was writing about surveillance, about paranoia, about people trapped inside systems they could not escape, about the particular loneliness of living in a world that had become too complicated to understand. Some critics at the time called it a departure, a risk, a sign that ABBA was losing its way. They were wrong. It was not a departure. It was an arrival. Four people who had lived through something real were finally making music that was real in the same way. Not the polished, radio-friendly reality of their earlier work, but something raw, something that had been earned. And yet, and here is the part that nobody who loved ABBA could have predicted, The Visitors would be the last album they ever made together. Not because it failed. It didn't fail. It went to #1. The singles charted. The interviews were given. The professional machine of ABBA kept turning, right up until the moment it stopped. But in those Stockholm studios, in those final sessions of 1981, the four people who had built one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of popular music were already saying goodbye. They just weren't saying it out loud. And there was one last song, one final recording, one moment that nobody who was there has ever been able to fully describe without their voice changing. What happened in that studio, on that last day, is something that ABBA has almost never spoken about. Until now. There are endings that announce themselves, that come with warning signs and final conversations, and the chance to say the things that need to be said. And then there are the other kind, the quiet endings, the ones that happen not with a door slamming, but with a door left slightly open, as if the people walking through it could not bring themselves to close it completely. ABBA's ending was the second kind. The last song they recorded together was called The Day Before You Came. It was released in October 1982. By that point, the four members of ABBA had already begun to drift into the separate lives that would define the decades that followed. Benny and Anni-Frid's divorce had been finalized. Björn had remarried. Agnetha was beginning the solo career that she had been quietly preparing for. The machine that had produced some of the most beloved music of the 20th century was winding down, and almost nobody outside of a small circle in Stockholm knew it. The Day Before You Came is not a song that most casual ABBA fans would name as their favorite. It does not have the immediate melodic hook of Dancing Queen, or the emotional devastation of The Winner Takes It All. It is slower, more interior. A song about the ordinary details of a life before something changed it. A woman describing her routine, her habits, the small and unremarkable shape of her days before a person arrived and altered everything. But listen to it, knowing what you now know. Listen to it knowing that the woman singing it had just lived through the end of her marriage, the end of her band, the end of a chapter of her life so large and so defining that nothing that came after would ever quite compare. Listen to it, knowing that the man who wrote those words was also standing at the end of something, that all four of them were. And suddenly, the song is not about a routine. It is about grief, about the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something dramatic, but from losing something so woven into the fabric of your daily life that you only understand how much it meant when it is gone. After the recording was finished, they went home. There was no farewell dinner, no final conversation where they acknowledged what had just happened. No moment where the four of them stood together and said, "This is it. This is the last time." They simply stopped. Agnetha has spoken about this in recent years, quietly, carefully, the way she speaks about most things that matter. She has said that she did not know, at the time, that it was the end, that she expected, in some vague and unexamined way, that they would come back together, that there would be another album, another tour, another reason to walk back into that Stockholm studio and do what the four of them had always done so well. But the call never came. The months turned into years. The years turned into a decade. And slowly, without announcement, without ceremony, ABBA became the past. What they could not have known, sitting in those separate lives in the years that followed, was what their absence was doing. How the music was traveling. How the songs were finding their way into places and people and moments that none of them had imagined. How a generation that had never seen them perform was discovering them. How the silence they had left behind was slowly, quietly, filling with something that sounded very much like love. Benny has said that he is proud of the Visitors, that he believes it is their most honest album, their most mature, the one that came closest to saying what they actually felt, rather than what the world expected them to feel. He said this recently, in an interview, sitting in the same city where it was all recorded, more than 40 years later. Anni-Frid speaks about that period with a kind of hard-won peace. The pain was real. The losses were real, but so was the music. And the music, she has said, was worth it, even now, even knowing everything it cost. Agnetha still lives in Sweden. She has not toured in decades. She has never fully explained why, but those who know her well say that the answer is not complicated, that she gave everything she had to ABBA, everything, and that what was left when it was over was something that needed to be protected, something quiet, something that belonged only to her. And Björn, who has spent the years since building Mamma Mia into a global phenomenon, and returning with Voyage and the Avatars, has said something that stays with you. He has said that he does not think of ABBA as something that ended. He thinks of it as something that paused, that the music was always bigger than the four of them, that it belonged, from the moment it was made, to everyone who needed it. The album they made while their marriages were falling apart became one of the most important records of the decade. The band that recorded it while quietly saying goodbye to each other never really said goodbye at all, because you cannot say goodbye to something that never stops. And ABBA never stopped.